Cass, it was game over within 10 minutes, this one, after Chelsea just got off to a blistering start against Palace.
Yeah, and Palace were awful. I can't describe it any different because they're slinging some terrible performances. I mean, I know they got beat by 7 by Liverpool. Liverpool took every chance that day at Selhurst Park. You know, Spurs beat them up at the Tottenham Stadium in the season. When they have a real bad one, they can really fall apart, Palace. Every time Chelsea run at them, they just look like they could play a simple ball down the sides of the centre halves and someone would run into space and cause a problem. It was so much wrong with that performance yesterday that Roy will be staggered because in some ways, to me, that was the worst I've seen Palace play this year.
Well, it was certainly the worst first 45
minutes all over the place.
Of a Palace side. And we heard Roy Hodgson there, very critical of his side, saying that they didn't have the aggression, they weren't first to the ball, for example. When you look at that first half in particular, they were 3-0 up at Chelsea by the time that whistle was blown. And the stats, and we mentioned the stats in the Manchester City Leeds game, I mean, Palace had no threat at all. They had no attempts, so no shots on goal at all. Chelsea had 21 touches in the opposition box. Palace had none.
No.
They had no threat whatsoever. I know yesterday we spoke about the situation at Crystal Palace and perhaps, and you've sort of mentioned this before, Cass, they're a dormant club. There's potential in Crystal Palace. But my goodness, what we're seeing it's, and I know there could be a huge overhaul this summer. Maybe some players will stay on with renegotiated contracts, but it just feels as though Palace are just always coasting, nothing more. Yeah,
Eze was poor yesterday. Riedewald was poor. They defended, Cahill got beat nearly every time by Kurt Zouma in the air. Every set piece, Kurt Zouma was on the end of a cross or Rudiger. It just looked like every time the ball went into 18 box, Palace were in trouble. Wilf is an issue because Wilf's played really poorly. He played poorly at Stamford Bridge early in the season and played poorly yesterday. And he's waving his arms up every time a misplaced pass by one of his team colleagues. No, Wilf is their best player. No one debates that. He is their best player. Mm-hmm. When he's on and he's good, he makes Palace a far better team. But when he's waving his arms around and getting angry with every decision, I think he's a problem for Palace. He's a problem for Roy. Because what do you do when your best player's clearly unhappy? What do you do? Mm-hmm. It's a tough one. Because he never looks like... he signed this new long-term deal and Palace is a big part of his career and he's been there since he was a kid and I get all of that. I think, he's had that move to Man United, didn't quite work out. I get there's a lot of frustration with Wilf, but he's becoming a bit of a problem if he starts finding his toys out of his pram and every pass. I mean, there was an instance yesterday, someone midfielder lays his ball and it just goes wide of him and his arms up in the air.
But then again...
That upsets your team, your fellow pro.
And I understand what you're saying, but equally, can you not understand how frustrated Wilfried Zaha must be when he knows, for example, as you pointed out, he is their most important player. He's their talisman. So much is reliant on Wilfried Zaha. But if his teammates aren't bringing him into the game... Of course he's going to get annoyed. Of course he's going to get frustrated. He wants to have better stats than what he's achieving now.
Well, it's a bit different because he did, when he got the ball a lot of times, he didn't particularly do a lot with it as well. But if every time your mate, your colleague gives you you're going to get bad passes. Make the best out of the bad pass, okay? Which he does on a lot of occasions. But when you start waving your arms around and upsetting your players around your team, Wilf is the best player in the team. To make him excel, yes, you've got to try and give him the best service you can, but it's never... I never liked it when other players did it if you misplaced a pass and do the crowd thing. I know there ain't no crowds, but, they'd look, wait, and then the crowd reacted because you give them a misplaced pass. He's meant to help you. He's meant to help his team colleagues, and I just think if, there's lots of challenges this summer for Crystal Palace because of the amount of players, contracts up, manager situation, and Wilf is the one where... I just don't think he really wants to be there now. He signed a long-term deal, but I don't see a player that's happy to be there. It's more of, I've signed this deal, I've got myself in a mess, what have I done? That's how I feel that Wilf's looking at it. And he might say differently. He might say, well, that's totally wrong. But that's how I see it from the outside, watching him, how he's performed, how he reacts.
Well, we know obviously there was a time where it looked like he was going to be leaving. He'd made it clear that he wanted to leave and perhaps join the club that he supported, Arsenal, for example. That never materialised, and as you say, he signed a new deal at Crystal Palace. But, you know, the only way he's going to leave is if Crystal Palace sell him.
Which they refuse to do, which,
yeah,
you know.
But, you know, if they want to make a huge overhaul of Crystal Palace, which it looks as though that could be on the cards, perhaps to do that as well is to sell someone like Zaha to get a lot more money in, to bring in more players, which I know.
Okay.
But where would he go is what I'm trying to say right now, because when it was mooted that Arsenal was a possibility, you might have seen that, but would he still be suited to Arsenal now?
Well, he can suit a lot of top. I think he could suit Liverpool, but I'm not sure Jurgen Klopp would want a player that waves his arms around and discontent and angry. And some fans of clubs might say, well, Mo Salah's done a bit of that, but you don't see it in general play. I'm talking, you know, when they get substituted, you can see they're quite clearly unhappy. I think it's a really complex one. Arteta, would he want a player at Arsenal, you know, challenging and just giving him other issues to deal with? I don't know. It's a very strange one. I think a lot of the managers are the only clubs who can afford him. I'm not sure they'd want a player that would clearly be unhappy if things are not going his way.